So, day 2 of the Australasian Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders Conference. Yesterday was a really terrific day from my perspective. As the Chief Executive of the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education and co-sponsor of this conference with the Public Health Association of Australia, I was absolutely delighted with the energy and the atmosphere around this conference yesterday. I know that we all heard some terrific presentations, and I think the measure of how successful that is and how worthwhile that all was the conversations that were going on in the breaks and afterwards. So hopefully we can continue in that same form today. Yesterday we were talking about what we needed to learn about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and about things like diagnosis and prevention. But today it's going to be a time to act, and that's really the theme of today's presentations. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners. I'll do no more than just mention that and make comment about Jan Hamill's stepping into the breach yesterday to do that welcome to country for us all, and I thank Jan once more for that. Let me also welcome the member for Murray, Sharman Stone, Dr. Sharman Stone, who will be speaking at one of the sessions later on. Sharman, as many of you know, is the co-chair of the parliamentary group, the Federal Parliamentary Group, and who has been such a terrific supporter of this issue. And I'm confident that she will continue in that vein with the new government. So yesterday's events, as I said, was really around what we needed to learn and what we've seen and witnessed from our experience in our research and our investigations. And we've heard from a range of people, including researchers, academics, not-for-profit organisations, carers, and parents more generally. So, and I think that one of the highlights of this has been the disparate group of people from across the country and from across the nation. And I especially welcome the very strong contingent from New Zealand who have come to Australia to tell us about what has been their experience and what they've learned in this area. So that's been really important for us here in Australia, and likewise people from across the nation, from Kimberley, from Perth, from Tennant Creek, a whole raft of fantastic speakers. So today's speakers will direct their attention to converting these lessons into meaningful and positive changes for the lives of people born with FASD, and really for ways that we can prevent this dreadful disability. We'll hear from 3 important and passionate individuals. We'll begin with Sue Miers, who is the chair of the National Organisation for Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders, the recently renamed No FASD. Sue, frankly, needs no introduction to most people, but needless to say, we should acknowledge the terrific work that she's done for more than 20 years in this field. So we'll look forward to hearing from Sue in a moment. Mick Gooda has returned to his grassroots today, Brisbane, Queenslander. Mick is the Social Justice Commissioner from the Human Rights Commission, and who has worked in this field for a long time in various ways, and I welcome Mick and I look forward to hearing what he has to say. And finally, June Oscar, again, who has been an enormous contributor to this and other community issues relating to Indigenous people, and the work that she and Maureen have been leading in the Fitzroy Valley will go down, I think, in the record of this area as peerless, frankly, in terms of the importance of what she and Maureen have done. So let me welcome Sue Miers to the podium. She's going to speak about From Denial and Invisibility to Recognition, FASD in Australia. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, everybody. I'd like to start by personally acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today and pay my very deepest respects to their elders past and present. But I'd also like to express my very deep concern at the magnitude of our failure as a nation to properly provide for the health and well-being of our first Australians. Thank you to the Public Health Association of Australia and FARE for convening this very significant event. And also a big thank you to all of you delegates. Your taking the time to attend this conference indicates your interest in this area, and from my perspective, that's very gratifying. I've met many of you before, but I must say it's rather nice to be reconnected at an Australian conference rather than a Canadian conference. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today about a story that spans 3 decades. The No FASD Australia story will have meaning for some, and hopefully for others will highlight the grassroots struggle which too often is a foundation to progress and change. As Liz Elliott mentioned, this conference coincides with the 40th anniversary since FAS was first described in the literature. I guess in terms of addressing a new discovery in the medical field, this is not a long time, but for families living with FASD and looking for answers and support, it feels like a lifetime. No one wants to be alone. No one wants to be left out, no one wants to be ignored, and certainly no one wants to be discriminated against. Yet for too many years, and through no fault of their own, this has been happening every day to Australian children and adults living with FASD. I understand that in many cases this situation has occurred mostly out of ignorance. However, ignorance is no excuse. To deny people their right to the services or support they need to reach their full potential and participate fully in their community is simply unacceptable, whatever the reason. As I reflect back over my time in advocacy, support, education and the creation of No Facade, now known as No FASD Australia, I can say with pride and subdued excitement that in the past few years there have finally been some major FASD turning points, and I regard this conference as one of these. However, I must also say that despite these turning points, many of the barriers encountered by families living with FASD are as evident now as they were when I began this journey 30 years ago, and unfortunately very little has changed for these families. While the barriers may be weakening in some areas, sadly understanding and appropriate supports are usually overwhelmingly invisible. Often individuals living with FASD and the families who support them are stressed, frustrated and socially isolated. Everyone, no matter what their condition, has the ability to contribute to life. Whether their challenges are physical, intellectual or behavioural, they have the absolute right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health and to be included in activities and events that are important to them. This is no less so for those living with FASD. In my presentation today, I'll be providing an overview of the role of No FASD Australia in claiming a 14-year history of non-government advocacy, education, training and support. I will describe the impact that FASD has on families from personal experience going back 3 decades, and how the responses by community health, education and social services can either exacerbate or ease the burden. Finally, I'll pass on some messages from parents and carers who struggle 24/7 to support their children, adolescents and adults who live with FASD. Too often, parents and carers' voices are unheard, but on Monday, 35 of us gathered together to meet, share and strengthen our collective voice. Whilst our knowledge may not always come from books or scientific research, our knowledge is based in the lived experience from which we draw our very deep understanding of this particularly complex condition. Canadian Dr. Barry Stanley has a son with FASD, and he says, knowing about FASD is not the same as understanding FASD. Most people know about FASD, but they don't understand it. Understanding FASD is an infinite process that increases our knowledge and leads to greater insight into the complex functions of the human brain. The families that No FASD Australia represents have a deep understanding of FASD. They've been living it for years. My interest is a personal story that began 30 years ago when a 21-month-old little girl came into our home as a foster placement. She came to us with a history of neglect and going through alcohol withdrawal at birth. However, there was no suggestion that this troubled start in life had in any way caused any long-term harm. Nevertheless, even in the first few days, my husband and I began to see behaviour patterns that were quite different from our 3 other children. She appeared not to learn from her mistakes or from consequences, and our usual parenting practices just didn't work. By early primary school, she'd made very little academic progress. She needed constant prompts and reminders and was constantly in trouble at school for her behaviour. Health and educational professionals we consulted downplayed all of our concerns about her learning and behavioural issues. Some believed that she would eventually catch up, while others suggested a change in our parenting style. But nothing worked, and phrases such as could do better if she tried, doesn't concentrate, attention-seeking behaviour and disobedient became regular entries in her school reports. When she was 10 years old, a magazine article about FASD jumped out at me. They were talking about our daughter: delayed academic and social development, memory problems, impulsivity, difficulty with friendships, difficulty separating reality from fantasy, very little understanding of cause and effect, difficulties with boundaries and ownership of property, but nonetheless a very loving and mostly happy child who always seemed to want to please. I was sure I'd found the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle, the key to understanding her difficulties and behaviours, and immediately made an appointment with a genetic specialist expecting my diagnosis to be confirmed. The assessment came back with a negative result. She didn't have the physical indicators of fetal alcohol syndrome, and we were sent away with no further information or ideas on how I or the school could manage her better. As she entered her teen years, the developmental gap had widened, and although she developed incredible skills to hide her deficits, her inability to comprehend instructions, manage peer relationships, understand cause and effect, and to a degree right from wrong, isolated her from her peers. Her self-esteem plummeted, and her behaviour spiralled out of control. Desperate for answers, I began scouring the internet and found not only helpful information and resources, but details of a FASD conference in Canada, which I was subsequently fortunate to attend. The trip led to my daughter's diagnosis of partial fetal alcohol syndrome by one of Canada's leading paediatric experts. The diagnosis left me with mixed feelings. I was of course relieved to learn that her developmental and behavioural problems were most likely based in organic brain damage, rather than being intentional or the result of my poor parenting. Nevertheless, I felt a great sadness as I now appreciated the frustration she must have experienced during a lifetime of failure and being told to do better, when in reality she was unable to do so. She was being the best she could be, despite her school reports to the contrary. I wondered why I had to go to Canada to get information and support that should have been available in Australia. And over the years, I've frequently wondered what a difference it could have made had that knowledge been available during her formative years. Now as an adult, the executive function capabilities that were missing in early childhood have never developed. She still strives for peer acceptance and has experienced many of the secondary issues related to FASD, including mental health issues, alcohol dependency, abusive relationships, homelessness and unemployment. The lack of knowledge and understanding amongst service providers has meant that her support needs have never been fully addressed, and many times their actions have actually set her up for further failure. When I returned home from the Canadian conference in 1999, I was determined to bring my newly discovered information to the attention of individuals and agencies in Australia who I thought should be taking responsibility for the prevention and management of FASD. From an aware layperson's perspective, I wrote a detailed report about the conference and highlighted the wide discrepancy between Canada's and Australia's professional awareness of the issues. I disseminated this report widely, naively expecting the relevant authorities and government agencies to take immediate action. I expected policies and strategies to be developed and funds to be allocated to deal with this unrecognised yet significant public health issue in Australia. Of course, that didn't happen. Only a very small number of organisations actually bothered to reply, and often the responses included infuriating suggestions about what I needed to do to promote what they obviously regarded as my cause. 1999 also marked the formal establishment of NoFasD, now known as FSD Australia, when a small group of volunteer parents and supporters in South Australia met at my kitchen table with the broad aim of doing something about FASD in Australia, or the lack of awareness of FASD in Australia. Divergent assessments of our children, frustration with the absence of professional awareness and respect for our knowledge, and the lack of Australian resources had brought us together as a grassroots organisation. This group became significant in advocating for the recognition of FASD in Australia, as well as advocating for appropriate support for individuals and families living with FASD. For the first 10 years, apart from a very small community grant, donations and a small income from speaking engagements and workshop presentations, our organisation was dependent on the donation of time and its operating costs by the executive membership. There are several early members of NoFasD present at this conference and who deserve acknowledgement. These include FASD educator Lorian Hayes, who is NoFasD's Indigenous spokesperson and has been working in this area long before I made the connection with my daughter. Lorian is acutely aware of the impact FASD is having in Indigenous communities, including her own family. She has undertaken substantial epidemiological research and has authored several unpublished papers on FASD, and more recently, a book that is available for purchase in the foyer. Another is Anne Russell, a courageous birth mother, whose contribution and advocacy over the years has been considerable and includes the publication of the first Australian books on FASD, also available for purchase in the foyer. NoFasD Australia's CEO, Vicky Russell, is also an early NoFasD member. She brings an articulate and professional voice to our organisation. Prior to her employment with us, Vicky worked tirelessly raising awareness of FASD and was responsible for Australia's first national conference on FASD, held in 2007 in Tasmania. During her employment with DEN in Tasmania, Vicky also developed a resource manual for parents and carers and a FASD prevention resource for service providers. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge Christine Rogan from across the ditch in New Zealand, who provided understanding, compassion and personal support to me way back in 1998 when no one in Australia appeared interested or would listen. Expanding our support base and engaging with professionals with sufficient authority was critical to gaining policy attention. So in a totally voluntary capacity, this is what I did for the first 12 years as NoFasD spokesperson. I researched the topic, lobbied and cajoled, often meeting incredible resistance, and at times feeling either intimidated or simply ignored. However, very slowly the tide began to turn, and today NoFasD Australia has established both national and global linkages to an expansive network of professionals, community members and organisations. Thankfully, NoFasD Australia has not continued to be a lone voice in pursuing the FASD cause, and I acknowledge that in the last few years especially, many other organisations and individuals have made a significant contribution in this area, and you have heard from many of these at this conference. However, without any intention to diminish their efforts, the presentation is focused primarily on the NoFasD Australia story. These next slides will give you an idea of just some of our key achievements during this time, and I'm not going to read them, but I'm just going to slowly flip through them. During this time, we also made many submissions in response to government consultation processes. In addition to what is listed on these slides, we also provided well in excess of 200 FASD workshops and keynote presentations to community groups and professional organisations, both nationally and internationally. We responded to hundreds of inquiries from families, community members, service providers, including teachers, allied health, medical and criminal justice professionals from across Australia, and all done in a totally voluntary capacity as a non-funded organisation. Without any loss of the original passion or determination, Fsd Australia was finally acknowledged in mid-2011 with short-term funding followed in late 2012 with a successful funding application for a 3-year federal grant from Doha under the Health Systems Capacity Development Fund. This enabled the employment of our first 2 permanent staff, Vicky, our CEO, and Layla, our policy officer, along with accompanying recognition as the national non-government peak body representing the interests of individuals, parents and families living with FASD. And we continue to build on the work of the last 14 years. Our successful funding grant heralded a time where the awareness of FASD as an issue of concern was beginning to be given the recognition it deserves. This recognition has led to some significant initiatives over the last 3 years where Fsd Australia have been actively involved in providing a consumer perspective to FASD research and the development of best practice in education and training and service delivery responses to FASD in Australia. The Australian FASD collaboration development of a diagnostic assessment tool for FASD, the FASD research projects funded by FARE, the FARE National Action Plan for FASD and its subsequent launch at Parliament House, FASD, the hidden harm, the report that stemmed from the federal government inquiry into FASD, and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We also participated in a roundtable meeting to provide input into the draft of a Commonwealth FASD action plan and welcomed the release of the plan and the commitment from the previous government of $20 million over 4 years to enhance efforts for primary prevention of FASD. We hope this commitment is honoured by the new government. On September the 9th this year, we marked International FASD Awareness Day by announcing our new name, Fsd Australia, and a new logo. At the same time, we also launched our first Fsd Australia strategic plan, 2013 to 2016, and we encourage you to pick up a copy from the table out in the foyer. And a new look website full of useful information and links. Please visit our site at www.nofasd.org.au. These changes signify Fsd Australia's future strategic direction as the national peak non-government organisation representing individuals and families living with FASD. Our vision is the prevention of alcohol-exposed pregnancies in Australia and an improved quality of life for those living with FASD, and our mission is to be a strong and effective voice for individuals and families. To achieve this, we have 6 priority areas: information and support services for individuals and families, community engagement, education and training, policy and advocacy, building partnerships and research. There are a number of key messages that we have for service providers and researchers. When it comes to FASD, if you are serious about prevention and improving the lives of individuals living with FASD and their families, it is these individuals and families that should be at the heart of all you do. Waiting for the evidence base before taking action has led to their needs not being met. Parents and carers are in crisis. They're burning out. There still appears to be a reluctance to talk about FASD. There are concerns that talking about alcohol use in pregnancy will stigmatise women, or that FASD is a label that will stigmatise the child. Yet these very attitudes perpetuate stigma. Health professionals and community service providers have a role to play in ending the silence and starting the conversation about FASD without attaching any blame or shame. The spectrum of conditions within FASD isn't a label, it's a diagnosis of a medical condition. Without a diagnosis, children, adolescents and adults with FASD are seen as a problem and labelled inappropriately. Interventions are often inappropriate, and this negatively impacts on their quality of life. There is still much to be done to help prevent FASD. To speak of FASD as totally preventable may be true, but is far too simplistic a message for many women. FASD is challenging and confronting and typically invokes a personal and professional reaction. The normative use of alcohol, and perhaps even the acceptance of high-risk patterns of alcohol use or binge drinking across all strata of society, must be responded to with open conversations about its use. With FASD, we are not just asking for lower risk patterns of drinking, we are advising abstinence. This is causing a reaction, even though it is the only prudent option. When scientific investigation has found a plausible risk, the abstinence message can only be relaxed if further scientific findings emerge that provide sound evidence that no harm will result. No such evidence currently exists, and I always found it perplexing that the previous NHMRC guidelines were themselves not scientifically evidence-based. It is important that FASD awareness is extended outside mainstream health settings. Workers from across the wider government and non-government community need upskilling to ensure the use of consistent primary prevention messages and to encourage program awareness which values girls and women across the lifespan, and not just in pregnancy, and fostering awareness that no alcohol use should be considered the best option in the planning for the pregnancy phase by both males and female parents. It is also about engaging with husbands, partners, uncles and grandparents. FASD is not just a girls' and women's issue, it is a community responsibility. In conclusion, I'd like to present a call for action. This call has come from discussion and feedback documented at a pre-conference function, Our Common Voice, held here on Monday afternoon. This forum, hosted by No Fsd Australia, REFADA and Alcohol Health Watch New Zealand, was planned to provide a safe and supportive environment where families living with FASD could share their lived experiences and have a voice at this conference. It was attended by 35 parents and carers of children and adults with FASD, and also a young adult with FASD. And I'm honoured to be their spokesperson. No one has the problem closest to their hearts and minds than parents and carers, and no one understands the gaps in service provider knowledge or the gaping holes in service provider support services than they do. The concerns they raised on Monday are the same as those I raised 14 years ago. Very little has changed for parents and carers since then. Overwhelmingly, they express feelings of frustration, exhaustion, isolation, and even anger at the constant feeling that their views and knowledge about their children's needs are not respected or understood by the service providers they encounter, and that their greatest challenge is not so much dealing with the challenges of supporting their child or adult with FASD, but rather dealing with service providers that have no understanding of FASD or who sometimes don't even believe in FASD. Parents and carers unanimously present the following call for action: that FASD be officially recognised and understood as a disability. The needs of children and adults with FASD and the parents and carers who support them must be recognised and understood by policymakers, the government and non-government sector. Every decision-making forum that relates to FASD must include the voices of parents and carers. And parents and carers ask for this call for action now, so that there is greater appreciation and awareness of every facet of the FASD condition, so that FASD is included as a core module in all professional and non-professional worker training courses to build tolerance and acceptance for difference, so that success for those with FASD is reframed, so that assessments account for the impact of FASD and contribute to planning for transitions across the lifespan, so that we end the stigma and start the conversation, and so that health professionals ask the questions and provide honest answers. This surely is the very least that families living with FASD deserve. And I'd like to finish now with a quote from Brenda McCrate, a carer of a child with FASD, and I've been using this quote for 14 years and I can still use it because it's still very applicable. Most children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder face more stress, more obstacles, more loneliness, more failure, and less success in a single day than most non-affected people face in a far longer time. These children are not exceptional because they have the condition. They become exceptional through trying to survive despite all odds. The tragedy lies not in the reality that some people have FAS. The tragedy lies in the reality that they are denied their basic human rights to have an appropriate education, to be raised in a supportive environment, and to grow up to be adults who participate in life in a productive and satisfying manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miers. Well done. So I will quickly move to Mick Gooda, as I said, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner from the Australian Human Rights Commission. Mick, your podium Podium's all yours.
Thank you, Michael. Can I thank you for the invitation here? At the moment, I'm a Queenslander living in Sydney. And living in Sydney when Queensland's running at 8-0 in State of Origin is a great place to be, let me tell you. But I told Michael this morning I felt like rolling in the dirt outside, having come back to Queensland on one of my rare visits. So it's appropriate that I begin today by acknowledging that we sit on the lands of the Ngambri people, a clan of the Turrbals. The city of Brisbane shares this ancient country of the Turrbals with the Jagera people as well. My people are the Gungaloo from central Queensland. If anyone knows central Queensland, they'll know Woorabinda. That's my country. That's Gungaloo country. My grandfather walked from Taroom Mission in 1926 to establish Woorabinda. Met my grandmother on her country. So I'm one of the fortunate ones with matriarchal lineage, having to go back just to my mother's mother to find out where we were living. And believe it or not, I also have elders. My elders tell me to pass on tributes to the local people for their continued fight for their country and their culture. They asked me to make a commitment to leave their culture and their country in the same condition it was when I arrived here. Can I acknowledge the Honourable Dr. Sharman Stone MP, Federal Member for Murray and Victoria? Can I acknowledge Michael Thorn and a good friend of mine, James Fitzpatrick? I acknowledge all of you who do work giving Australian children the best possible start at the beginning of their lives. The work that you do addressing FASD is sadly a far too much critical factor to this best possible start in the lives of many of our children. Sue, can I thank you for sharing your family story with us? It's very brave to get up here and talk about those things that happen in our families. For I think every Aboriginal person, that story is the story of our families as well. Finally, I'd like to dedicate my presentation today to the women of the Fitzroy Valley. For almost 4 years I've held this office of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner within the Australian Human Rights Commission. This position provides me with a unique opportunity in my life of public service to contribute more fully to the quality of life our people are able to enjoy. My role in this position requires me to do a few things. After all, there's an Act of Parliament. I'm required to submit a social justice and native title report to Parliament every year. Lucky enough, I submitted that about 2 weeks ago to the Attorney General, and come 13th of December, and yes, it's Black Friday, I will launch that report after it's sitting in Parliament for the required 15 days. But I'm also required to comment on legislation, policies and programs as they relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And most importantly for me, I think, to monitor the enjoyment and exercise of human rights by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in this country. This year marks the 20th year since the position came into being as a result of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the Native Title Act, and a Commission inquiry into racial hatred. As Social Justice Commissioner, my agenda is focused on building relationships using a human rights-based approach. I think relationships are built on reciprocated understanding, dialogue, tolerance, acceptance, respect and trust. And I believe human rights are one of the most powerful tools we have to build those good relationships. And to guide the work that I do in this position, I've particularly used the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This declaration is a foundation document articulating how human rights standards apply in an Indigenous context. It contains a number of key principles underpinning the rights that it seeks to protect. And those principles can be summarised as self-determination, participation in decision-making, underpinned by the concepts of free, prior and informed consent and good faith, respect for and protection of culture, and non-discrimination and equality. I'll come back to those later in this presentation. In addressing difficult and sensitive issues like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, I think these principles provide significant guidance. And I think they apply to the non-Aboriginal community as well, and you'll see what I mean as I go through these. But today I'm also here to talk about the role governments and other stakeholders working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities using to address alcohol-related harm, including FASD. Using the principles from the Declaration, supported by evidence, I suggest the role of governments and others is to facilitate and enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to take control of the response to FASD in our respective communities. Let me tell you quickly about a relationship that has developed during my tenure as Social Justice Commissioner. It is with the communities of the Fitzroy Valley, in particular people like June Oscar, who was talking after me. In my first social justice report in 2010, I undertook an extensive case study of Fitzroy Valley. In 2007, a number of senior Aboriginal women, led by June Oscar, Emily and Maureen Carter and Mama G. Hand, supported by some senior men, decided that something needed to be done about the increasing violence and dysfunction in their communities. I use the word some when referring to the men of the Fitzroy Valley advisedly, because the women I mentioned were vilified in parts of their communities for having the audacity to take a stand that would eventually change the status quo. Alcohol abuse was rife, causing violence, depression and intergenerational harm. In 2007, there were 13 suicides over a 12-month period. To put this into some perspective, if this rate of suicide was applied to the population the size of Perth, this would equate to 500 suicides per month. In my 2010 social justice report, I case studied a story over the course of 3 years about how the community of the Fitzroy Valley led transformative changes in their region and lifted their communities out of chaos and despair. June Oscar, again, was notable in this. Their actions included a community-led approach to FASD. The case study outlined the processes of moving from a community crisis to a community in control. At the beginning of the case study, I used a very poignant quote from June, a part of which I'd like to repeat here. June said, "This is a story of colonisation, the threat of losing our cultural authority to manage our societies and the despair that has come from that disempowerment. It's a story of grief and trauma and the continued pain of living with drugs and violence. I want to tell a different story. It's about how Aboriginal people can be authors of our own stories and not passive and powerless subjects in stories told and written by others. The start of the journey is dependent on the leadership of Aboriginal community, but the journey from this point on will largely be shaped by the partnerships that we can create and build with governments." I repeat that quote here because June, of course, was 100% correct. To address the issues confronting our communities, such as alcohol abuse and FASD, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to become authors of our own stories. That is, we have to take control and take responsibility. However, we can't do this alone. Our communities need partnerships with government, businesses and NGOs. The roles of these players, though, is to support us to take responsibility. This includes removing structural and systemic impediments that hinder Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from taking that control. I just want to return to those principles that I spoke about and how they can guide us in FASD. Self-determination. When realised, creates a community-wide agency that stifles the toxicity of victimhood and powerlessness. Michael OBrien, Professor of Social Education at the University of Kansas, states, "Self-determined people are causal agents. They make things happen in their lives. They are goal-oriented and apply problem-solving and decision-making skills to guide their actions. They know what they do well and where they need assistance. Self-determined people are actors in their own lives instead of being acted upon by others." A sense of control is transformative. That is precisely why it improves our well-being. It can transform an individual or a community from the passivity of victimhood into pride, action and responsibility. A self-determining community not only exerts control, but it self-regulates. And it looks after the most vulnerable in our communities. It decides how disputes are resolved, how decisions are made and what protocols for behaviours are acceptable. And it takes responsibility to ensure the well-being of the entire community. A community like this determines how it will address difficult and sensitive issues like FASD. It will determine what support it needs from partners, including government and other service providers. Those working with Aboriginal communities need to work with and in ways that empower communities to become agents of their own change. The role of government, again, is to remove obstacles that prevent us from taking control and to build capacity within our communities so we can step up and take these responsibilities. Here I'd like to point out some interesting developments in the Northern Territory. On 31 October this year, the Aboriginal Peak Organisations of the Northern Territory, APON, launched a set of principles aimed at empowering Aboriginal organisations and communities. A number of NGOs have publicly endorsed these principles designed to guide their interaction with Aboriginal organisations. These principles have been designed to empower communities and shift from a narrow service delivery focus to one based on a development approach. The second principle of participation in decision making based on the concepts of free, prior and informed consent and good faith. Governments, NGOs or industry have obligations to ensure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples actively participate in decisions and processes that affect their rights. Further, given the sensitive nature of FASD, it is imperative that prevention, intervention and management strategies are developed in partnership with the people impacted by FASD, particularly women, children, in families and in our communities. The evidence is clear, crystal clear, that solutions to FASD must be owned by the community. They must have buy-in from the community and they must be community generated. The project being undertaken in the Fitzroy Valley to address FASD is founded on community buy-in. It is led by the community and supported by organisations such as the George Institute and the Sydney University. It encapsulates the partnership model perfectly, and I will allow June to go into more specifics, but community and continuing consent processes are in my mind why there has been such a high participation rate from the community in this project. The project, in my mind, is the embodiment of the principle of people participating in decisions using their free, prior and informed consent. The third principle is one of respect and protection for culture. As you all know, impaired memory and inability to learn and retain information are major components of FASD. And as such, FASD is a genuine threat to the preservation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. Behavioural and learning problems limit educational gains. Given our oral traditions of passing down cultural knowledge through stories and ceremonies, there is a very real possibility that cultural knowledge will be lost as a result of FASD. The majority of cultural knowledge isn't part of our written history. Therefore, its continuation is reliant upon the ability of elders to pass this knowledge on to future generations. The threat to Aboriginal cultures in the Fitzroy Valley was one of the main drivers for the community to decide to take action to address FASD. International human rights standards have developed to the point where states have obligations to work with Indigenous people to implement measures for the maintenance, protection, development, transmission of culture and cultural knowledge. Let me stress this. The obligation is to work with us, not to do it to us. But I think it's also important to understand that out of this principle comes the concept of cultural knowledge, cultural competence and cultural security. We need to work with people who understand our worldview, our way of working and our way of communicating. And sometimes it's simple as understanding the context in which our peoples live. Let me give you an example far removed from the Fitzroy Valley. Last week in Sydney, I met a Senator, Vern White from Canada. Vern formerly worked for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And he told me of a strategy to recruit Inuit people into the Mounties from Nunavut, a remote province in Canada up near Alaska. One of the exam questions involved scenarios of situations such as domestic violence, which either could escalate or settle down using a rating scale of red, amber or green. There was a spectacular failure rate amongst Inuit candidates to this question. Vern himself, an Indigenous Canadian, had to confront other questions about the intelligence of the Inuit, their ability to exercise judgment so crucial to the role of a police officer, and the wisdom of even thinking about recruiting Inuit into the police force. These questions went to the heart of the entire strategy because judgments were being made on the basis of this one question. Then we had the light bulb moment. When someone realised there's no traffic lights in Nunavut. The question used a scale that had no relevance to their lives at all and in which they had no experience. Back in Fitzroy, the FASD project is run by women, ably and aptly supported by the George Institute. So the worldview of Fitzroy has been embedded from day one. And I think you will agree the results speak for themselves. As for the Inuit, well, they went away and reconfigured this question using reference to which they could relate. And funny enough, they saw spectacular results in the opposite direction, with the Inuit candidates having a far greater success rate in that question than the rest of the population. So think about cultural competence and cultural security. And if you need reminding, think about red, amber and green. I don't think there's any traffic lights in the Fitzroy Valley at all, June, is there? The final principle is equality and non-discrimination. Access to critical services is a key component to equality. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities need access to adequate, appropriate and affordable health care for women and their families. To help prevent and address FASD, these services need to include sexual and reproductive health, as well as health education on the harm caused by FASD. And it's imperative that these services are delivered in a culturally safe and secure manner. The government has an obligation to remove all the barriers that inhibit access to health services, education and information. There are many steps governments can take to improve access to services. These could include training for health and other professionals on FASD, funding early intervention services and ensuring there is appropriate community care for those affected by FASD. Support services are needed across education, health, community services, employment and the criminal justice sectors for the communities, families and individuals affected by FASD. To conclude, I want to return to the Fitzroy Valley. It's a beautiful country. In Fitzroy there is great and strong leadership who are striving for a better future. The communities in the valley are connected to country and culture. The story of the Fitzroy Valley in recent years is a story of how strong leadership can drive change within their communities. Rather than a coercive top-down approach to change and development, The work in the Fitzroy Valley addressing FASD is true in community engagement and true self-determination in practice. For me, the story of the Fitzroy Valley shows how strong leadership, supported rather than dictated to by government, can result in communities dealing with the most sensitive and intractable issues on their own terms. For me, it shows that we can be masters of our own destinies. But let me say this, confronting challenges like this are nothing new to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia. Some of our people have been doing this for over 60,000 years. We are used to doing the hard things, and we are used to surviving. And I end this in this vein by saluting the women of the Fitzroy for confronting this issue. Women who have been prepared to ask the hard questions, particularly of themselves. Women who put their children front and centre of their lives. Women who lead from the front. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mick. A typical, thoughtful and insightful presentation and representations of views about this very difficult issue. So thank you, Mick. I'm not going to spend any time introducing June Oscar other than to welcome her to the podium. June has travelled all the way from Fitzroy, as Mick has said, and so I look forward to hearing what June's got to say this morning. Welcome, June.
Pressure. The Australasian Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders Conference. My sharing with you today is continuing on from what Mick has shared on our journey in structuring circles of hope in our community. First, I would, before reading to you our story, I wish to say, Jalanguru manangare balangare, Ngaine Nyanjili, June Oscar, Fitzroy Crossing ninge, Bonaban ninge, Balangare Grama we Bugayana, Ngadayo Moy, Juralene, Yanangene, Baljoane, Ulangara, Bonabangara, Tangar Nangandaje, Mata Walinyaga, Yarangene, Jandi Yano, Yarangan Moy, Yarangan Jando, Perango Tangani. When you Unguraga, Tangana Yarangan, I say to you, good morning to everybody, and I say to you in Bunaba, my language, to the men and women and children of this country, the ones from before, the ones now, and the ones to come. We acknowledge you all and your place, this beautiful place. I share with you stories from our families, from our country. This is our story. I hope you will listen and find something in this story. The traditional owners of this land we meet on today, we respect you all, your elders and families, past and present, and those who are coming. I also want to acknowledge and thank the conference chair, Mr. Michael Thorn, for your continued support and persistence in this important work. Indigenous people attending and all visitors, I acknowledge the vital role you all play in your communities and in your organisations and in your families and in the families of others. Members of my own community, Auntie Maminji, my niece Maureen Carter, her colleague Trish Muir from Nindalungari Health Services, Cultural Health Services, the Muraloo team members, a fantastic group here today, well represented, and our partners, the George Institute, Sydney Uni, the Telethon Institute for Child Health Research, and the Australian Human Rights Commission, particularly the Sex Discrimination Commissioner's Office and the Social Justice Commissioner's Office. These gatherings are hard work and depend on skilled people to organise. So I wish to acknowledge and thank FARE and the Public Health Association Australia for bringing us together to this gathering for these past few days. Mick Gooda, a brother and friend, thank you for your leadership and support on the many and varied issues you advocate for our peoples across this country. Dr. Sharman Stone, MP, member for Murray, a strong champion for fetal alcohol spectrum disorders within the Parliament of Australia, a friend indeed. Good to see you here, Sharman. I will begin with a quote by child psychiatrist Stanley Greenspan from a book written by Gabor Mate called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which places alcohol and drug addiction within an understanding of early childhood trauma. The theme of trauma in the lives of individuals and communities is the story of my presentation today. Greenspan said, "If our society were truly to appreciate the significance of children's emotional ties throughout the first years of life, it would no longer tolerate children growing up or parents having to struggle in situations that cannot possibly nourish healthy growth." Today, the story that I want to share with you is a little of my own and our community and the organisation that I am CEO of, which is Marninwarntikura Fitzroy Women's Resource Centre. It is a story of the great strength and resilience of women facing often overwhelming challenges. The women's courageous and honest journey in confronting excessive alcohol consumption and understanding its horrific consequences has led our community to where it is today, structuring circles of care and nurture to nourish the healthy growth of our families and children. Our community is laying the foundations for an emerging future full of hope. Over 2 decades ago, in the late 1980s, a group of women from the Fitzroy Valley came together. They had experienced the horror of domestic violence and they felt the destructive effects of widespread alcohol abuse. Marginalised from governance structures and mainstream society, they stood on the sidelines of our community, watching in silence as addictive, aggressive and abusive behaviours were becoming entrenched in the Valley's societal fabric. They saw a future of generations yet to come being born into cycles of despair. These cycles are fueled by the depressing and numbing effects of alcohol, where the traumas originating in the past are never acknowledged. But the pain and grief caused by these traumas are intensified in the present. The women knew, for the sake of our children, that the Fitzroy Valley's communities had to be freed from violence and harm. They took a stand against the unchecked supply of grog in the valley. Their stand started a long and arduous fight against the alcohol industry and those in the valley with a vested interest in its sale. Only recently have we secured meaningful consequences from this fight, outcomes that I'll explain later, but along the way the women continued to take critical and purposeful steps towards building a framework of care and nurture focused on supporting the social and emotional well-being of the Valley's communities. In the early 1990s, the Women's Refuge, the heart of Marninwarntikura, was established. It quickly became and remains a site of safety, a shelter where women are not only protected from violence, but are given the space to discuss their worries and concerns and dare to voice their dreams for the future. The space the women built in which they could gather to share and listen to each other's stories and experiences began the journey we continue to travel, advocating for the rights of women and their children while restructuring hope into our communities. Before I go further, I want to give you an insight into our recent history and the commitment and belief we have in who we are as Aboriginal people. In the Fitzroy Valley, we live in an ecologically and culturally rich region with a remarkable history. We have a deep knowledge of our belonging and continuous connection to our country and with each other. Without this knowledge, we would not possess the resilience to deal with the historical and present-day traumas that afflict our communities. To believe in our rights to a future, to hold on to hope, to allow the intergenerational lessons of responsibility from our ancestors to permeate the present, to create an environment where families feel safe and actively participate in all the possibilities that life offers, from education to various forms of employment and parenthood, has always been our goal. Let me paint you a picture of the Fitzroy Valley. It is a region in the central Kimberley in northwestern Australia, with an approximate population of 4,500 people, of whom 80% are Aboriginal. There are 40 connected communities or outstations spread across the valley, which family groups frequently move between. The area is characterised by the topography of the Great Fitzroy River, a sweeping floodplain, savanna grasslands, intersected by many tributaries and red and black creviced limestone ranges, the remnants of an interconnecting 390 million year old Devonian reef system. Balila country, we call it in Bunava. It is a beautiful place to grow and learn about the interconnections of all human beings and nature. Fitzroy Crossing, where I live and work and have grown up around, is the regional service hub located on Bunuba country, my ancestral homeland. Aboriginal people across Australia belong to different land and seascapes that we call country. We, the Bunuba, are the traditional owners of the northern part of the Fitzroy Valley. Our neighbours are the Guniandi. Their ancestral homelands to the east of Fitzroy Crossing stretch across similar fertile river country to our own. In consequence, we share many cultural traditions. Below the wild rivers of the Fitzroy River, below the wild waters of the Fitzroy River, stretching far south is Gilgi country, the rolling sand hills of the desert. On a non-Aboriginal map, it is demarcated as the 85,000 square kilometres of the Great Sandy Desert. Here, we know it as the ancestral homelands of the Walmatjari and Wangayunga people. The current geographical demographics of the region reflects the emergence of the Fitzroy Valley from the collision of two worlds. In the closing tumultuous decades of the 19th century, European pastoral settlers drove their way north. From first encounter anthropological records combined with our cultural knowledge, we have assessed that there were approximately 3,000 Bunuba people at the time when Europeans first occupied our country. The few decades of European settlement saw Aboriginal people enslaved, killed in long periods of frontier conflicts, and by introduced infectious European diseases, along with being forcibly removed and displaced from their ancestral homelands. By 1936, the Bunuba population had been horrifically diminished to around 300 people. We know that because of a census conducted by anthropologist Phyllis Cabery, we lost many of our lawmen and women and traditional healers, the people who carried much of our knowledge and stories of our culture and country. As the 20th century progressed, Walmatjari and Wangayunga people moved up from the desert and occupied the country of the Bunuba and Guniandi. The four major language groups now coexist in the Fitzroy Valley. We live with these dramatic recent historical changes, from the dominance of the pastoral industries semi-feudal society to today's society, structured around government and other community organisations' delivery of services. Still, in the face of these great changes, we have found ways to bring our cultural and spiritual identities together. We have formed new protocols to govern our communities and define our coexistence. In the opening decade of this century, all four language groups have had their native titles determined. Our connection to our ancestral homelands is now recognised in Australian law. We have spent years preparing our claims and asserting our rights to our country. We have had to prove to government structures by European legislative traditions grounded in individual property rights of our ongoing traditions, cultural and ceremonial practices, and communal ownership over practically every square inch of the valley. We have prevailed in the Western legal system. We have proved under the principles laid out in the Mabo decision that our traditional ownership of our country has not been extinguished by European occupation. Even then, Australian governments have failed to provide sufficient funding and support to our native title bodies to allow us to govern effectively and respond to the unique needs of our community. Native title confronts the Valley with contradictory dualities of cultural loss and simultaneously the strength of our cultural heritage and traditional practices, the empowerment of recognition and consequently the disempowerment of being inadequately incorporated into the governance of Australian nationhood. The instability and community stress triggered by such contradictions, combined with the legacy of pain I've described, which is present in our everyday lives, compounds our sense of grief. Alcohol is both a symptom of this grief and its ongoing cause. My own dream, my hope, is to bring about better life opportunities for the children in my community and town of Fitzroy Crossing. But to do this, we have to be collaboratively imaginative and socially innovative in the institutions we envision and the governance structures we establish. In 2006, the Valley experienced an overwhelming sense of tragedy. In that single year, there were 55 alcohol-related deaths, including 13 suicides. In the face of immense community grief and emotional pain, I felt the burden of leadership like never before. We had to take decisive action. I raised my dream for a future of hope at the 2007 Marninwarntikura's annual women's meeting at Bush. The women's fight had gone on for too long with too little impact. The circles of safety and care that we had worked tirelessly to establish were threatening to unravel with the ongoing ravages of alcohol. Together we took an unprecedented step. With the support of our elders, we lobbied the Director of Liquor Licensing, seeking an initial 12-month moratorium on the sale of full-strength takeaway liquor across the Fitzroy Valley. We met with fierce resistance, especially from some of our own community members who were addicted to a destructive lifestyle. But we were unrelenting in what we knew was a necessity to break a circuit of chaos and grief. The restrictions have now been in place for over 6 years due to ongoing community support. Many who opposed our efforts are now thankful for the positive impacts that have become entrenched since the restrictions were put in place. Independent evaluations from the University of Notre Dame show what have been achieved by the restrictions. 28% reduction in alcohol-related police interventions, 36% reduction in alcohol-related presentations to the hospital, and a 14% increase in school attendance. These are earlier statistics, and we're in the process of updating on these areas. But let me be clear, the alcohol restrictions have never been intended as a panacea. They are one part of an ongoing strategy, a strategy which will fundamentally alter the way our society is governed. To reintroduce into the lived spaces of the Valley community ownership, community-led development, and control of our lives. We could not begin to imagine a different future of governance while shrouded by the confusion and chaotic destruction induced by alcohol. We needed the space to think, plan, and respond to the crisis. In the aftermath of the restrictions, we have had to come to terms with and confront a community in varying and complex states of trauma. But when turning towards the future, we have taken the very difficult and often painful step of asking, but what of our children? It is our children, from the first moment of conception to the growth in their mother's womb, the first phases of learning in their early lives, and the turbulence of adolescence, who have been the unintended victims of alcoholic despair. As most of you will know, alcohol has a pernicious effect when a mother drinks during her pregnancy. There has been no safe dose of alcohol identified while a woman carries her child. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASD, represents a group of permanent disorders caused by exposure of the unborn child to alcohol in utero. They range from extreme neurodevelopmental disorders severely impinging on a child's ability to learn to alcohol-related birth defects. FASD does not only impact on an individual's social and emotional development and their capacity to learn and remember, but in a region such as ours, built on histories of oral inheritance and extensive family interconnectedness, it threatens our entire cultural and social cohesiveness. In 2009, a couple of years after the restrictions had been implemented, our community again took leadership. Marninwarntikura entered into a partnership with Nindalangari Cultural Health Services, the George Institute for Global Health, and the discipline of Paediatrics and Child Health at the University of Sydney Medical School, and our families. We initiated the Lililwan project, Lililwan meaning in Creole, all the little ones, a community-consented and informed prevalence study of FASD across the valley. It was a groundbreaking move, the first time in Australia that a study such as this had been conducted. What was more, it was community-owned and controlled, as Mick Gooda mentioned. There was overwhelming community endorsement. Those who participated entered into a space free from blame and shame. It was a collaboration between our community members, families with their children, to recognise who we are in the present and our needs for the future. We accumulated a body of empirical evidence to support our demands for services that could respond to the unique and complex needs of our children. The results were distressing. Of the 80% of children born in 2002 and 3 who participated in the study, we diagnosed 1 in every 4 children with FASD. Keep in mind that no other prevalence study has been conducted across Australia. We have recorded the highest rate of FASD in the world. I'm not saying the Fitzroy Valley is unique with its extraordinarily high FASD prevalence, but what I am saying is that in the valley we have the evidence to prove the extent of the crisis. No doubt this crisis exists in many other places of similar circumstances in our country. Our community sees these statistics in the faces and behaviours of children we love and care for, children with attention deficits, impaired judgments, social anxieties, and inappropriate and unpredictable behaviour in social interactions. These children are the ones in our society who find it challenging to self-regulate. They can show unrestrained love and trust to everyone, including strangers, or hurt, pain and anger towards even the slightest imposed authority. These are the children who begin their early life traumatised, frustrated and restless in lessons directed towards repetitive memorising of facts and figures, easily overstimulated and aggravated in rigid educational environments. They grow into the statistics of the unqualified, the unemployed, and they add to the over-representation of Aboriginal people in our criminal justice system. If there is anything that inflames a community's sense of hope for a different future, that necessitates a change of lifestyle, institutions and governance, it is when your children are harmed and the possibilities for their future severely and cruelly curtailed. FASD is 100% preventable and does not need to occur. But for now, it is our reality. It is not an indication of neglect, but of deep-seated trauma. A trauma emanating from the past which time again is inadequately responded to by government. Just as we fought for our native title, knowing it had not been extinguished, we must reignite hope, knowing that there is a different way forward. As with native title, this cannot be achieved simply through legal recognition, nor purely through the revitalisation of our cultural practices, and, as has been made plainly clear to us, not even with the circles of care and safety we've established, which I began this speech with. Only recently, Marninwarntikura was told by the state government in Western Australia that $300,000 would be cut from our women's refuge. This refuge that places women and children in a safe and caring environment. An imposed, non-negotiated decision of money-saving tactics, a decision entirely uninformed by the integrated and holistic models of care we are trying to create, not observing the principles of human rights that Commissioner Gooda outlined. While centres of power 2,000 kilometres away in Perth continue to exert their authority over us, we cannot hope to move along the path of self-determination and overcome FASD. The critical word here is dialogue. Governments have to understand our commitment to our own, and to own and deal with the crisis of FASD in our community. We have a new government with a Prime Minister who, for the first time in history, calls himself the Prime Minister for Indigenous Affairs. We have to take these words as a sign of hope. We cannot ignore, nor do we want to, the reality that we will live with the prevalence of FASD for generations before our preventative measures will take effect. Our community has conceived and implemented the Marulu strategy. Marulu, again, a Bunaba word meaning precious, worth nurturing. It is founded on what I've been discussing, a collaborative community circle of care model which works on a three-pillared approach of prevention, diagnosis and management of FASD. We are creating multidisciplinary working groups with the informed expertise of health professionals, clinical psychologists, community organisations and community workers. We do not work in the segmented silos of government. Instead, we are creating therapeutic services functioning on multiple levels. The dissemination of information across the valley about the causes and consequences of FASD, supporting parents and carers of children with FASD, developing new models of paediatric and allied health care, and forming alternative pathways for education and employment. But the word Marulu is more than a strategy. It resonates with our priority. Children with FASD must be recognised for the lifelong challenges they will contend with, but also for their precious existence, for the qualities they have which must be nurtured, not condemned or discriminated against. If we can implement sustainable structures of support, then all our children will have hope. In essence, we are contravening universal standards of human rights if we do not recognise the fundamental human right for children to feel safe and dream of a future with boundless possibilities. We need to open our minds and imagine a different relationship between our communities in the Fitzroy Valley with the Australian nation state made up of governments, institutions and the private investment economy. We need to find a way to marshal the resources, money, expertise and innovation and culture to transform the environment that we are trapped in. We have to believe that we can build a different relationship with government, one that does not involve unilateral decisions to defund projects because it does not fit into some central power funding formula. A relationship that doesn't rely on the goodwill and patronage of certain friendly ministers and bureaucratic champions. A relationship that doesn't depend on the capacity of the community to embarrass or shame the nation if they don't support us. What we need is the long-term security of development funding, which will allow our communities to create environments of nurture and care. There is innovative thinking throughout the world about harnessing private investment with community and government partnerships, where the relationship is based on the achievement of social improvement and community development. It should be about measurable outcomes of social and emotional well-being. This should be the basis of investment. Structuring circles of hope is about using this form of investment to harness the power of women to allow their dreams, their hopes to flourish. We have an extraordinary culture in the Fitzroy Valley. We are most proud of. And this is the basis of our reconstruction. We are opening a book on the story of hope, one that begins here, but it is international in its scope. Thank you.